Here's your host, Alex Garrett.
Well, I have a very special guest on my line right now on the Alex Garrett Podcast Network. She wants to have one leg up on policing and law enforcement and helping law enforcement through a time when not all, politicians are supportive. And I'm so honored that Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith has joined me. She's a spokesperson for the National Police Association. Before we get to the topic today, Sergeant Smith, who is the National Police Association?
So we are a national organization that works so hard to bring attention to the anti-police efforts that we're seeing around the United States that really challenge the effectiveness of law enforcement. And we do it through mailings, through we have a national television show called the NPA Report. We obviously do television and radio hits and public service announcements and legal filings on behalf of not just police officers or agencies, but we get involved in various cases such as the National Covenant school shooting. We're the ones who are suing to get that manifesto released. We've got a podcast, we publish books, we publish articles, we have a great website, nationalpolice.org, and we're just trying to help citizens do things, real concrete things that they can do to help support their law enforcement officers.
Earlier this month, we had National Night Out. How successful was that around the country that you could tell?
Well, I tell you, I did a lot of media interviews about National Night Out, and it's one of my loves. I ran my agency's crime prevention program for many years, and National Night Out, which has been in existence for over 2 decades, is such a wonderful program for not just people to get to know their police officers, but for neighbors to get to know their neighbors, and that is so very important. And this year, National Night Out really had a resurgence, and we were so happy to see that.
Well, you were pitched to me, to be honest, about a totally different topic, which is the gun control situation, and with your expertise in law enforcement. I mean, we saw 2 shootings now over the weekend, and then yesterday, one each. And when you see that, it tells me that law enforcement's not being asked to step in as much right now. When you see a dollar store being shot up, and of course everything being locked up in every grocery store, and Dwayne Reed, doesn't that mean they don't want the cops around? How bad is that?
Well, the problem that we see is that 9 out of every 10 police departments are short-staffed in this country. So it's a lot of retail establishments. It's not that they don't want the police there. It's just that the police don't have enough officers to respond. You also have in certain areas like San Francisco and other cities in California, in New York, in Chicago, and other areas around the country, you have prosecutors who have made it very clear that they will not prosecute, for example, retail theft cases under a certain dollar amount. And in fact, in California, they made it legislation. They made it a law that I believe it's under $900. They're not even going to consider it a crime. So it's not that people don't want the police around. It's that there are not enough police to go around, and they can't really do anything about certain crimes like retail theft. Now, we do have companies like, for example, Lululemon. They have a no 911 rule in their company that if an employee sees theft going on, they are discouraged. And in fact, they are told, if you call 911, you will be fired. And frankly, we have seen that happen to Lululemon employees around the country. So you're right. There are some organizations, some stores who don't want the police to respond.
It's unbelievable. Now, I'm in New York City, and obviously we love our police department, but there are other cities where departments are being folded up, and I think that's pretty dangerous. You would never see that in the mainstream cities, all right? That could never possibly happen.
Well, yeah, it very much depends on the city. I just spent the weekend in Chicago, and while I felt confident to be able to move around freely, there were a lot of things that I saw in the city of Chicago that I wasn't particularly enamored with, just as a as a citizen walking around now that I'm retired.
And seeing that, I mean, do you ever feel called to jump into action even though you are retired, Sergeant?
Well, there's something called the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act, and so what that allows is for any honorably retired or separated police officer in this country can go through annual qualifications with their firearm, and then they can receive basically permission from both their state and the federal government to carry a firearm in almost any place that a on-duty police officer would be able to carry. So my husband and I, he's also a retired cop, we both take advantage of that. So yeah, absolutely. This weekend, while I don't live in Chicago anymore, but while I was in the city, I was with my daughter and several friends. So absolutely. I was armed, I was aware, and yeah, if I have to jump in, I absolutely will. Not just to protect, my life and the life of my family, but of strangers. That's what cops do. We put our life on the line to protect people we don't know. And will I do that as a retiree? Of course. And most cops I know will do the same thing.
Well, I want to ask you about that because there are off-duty cops also being injured as well as those in uniform. I mean, it's alarming how much injury the police are suffering off or on duty, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. We've had well over 200 police officers shot in the line of duty already this year. I believe 35 as of today fatally shot. Officer ambushes continue to go up. We're on this 10-year upward trajectory of police officer ambushes, and we are just seeing more and more attacks occurring on law enforcement officers. When I started in the 1980s, certainly a very dangerous profession, but only the most hardened of criminals would dare to come after a cop, to attack a cop. Now, sometimes it seems like it's a free-for-all where we just see the attacks on law enforcement officers occur over and over and over again. And in the most innocuous situations. We've had police officers murdered responding to traffic crashes and fires and very simple 911 calls where almost everything that we go to these days has the potential of a law enforcement officer being gravely injured.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I mean, this is eye-opening, and I know I brought you on to talk about the Jacksonville shooting. I don't know. You're obviously fired up about everything. So could the Jacksonville shooting have been prevented with police presence? And you also want to talk about the whole situation where he was legally able to carry this gun. I mean, how are these, if they go through background checks and still able to carry? Meanwhile, even cops maybe have a difficult time carrying post, their duty and retirement, right?
Well, sure. The shooter in the Jacksonville case, Ryan Palmeter is his name. He's 21 years old. He had a history of mental health issues. He had threatened suicide, and his father called the police. He was currently getting psychiatric help. He was on medication. He had been in Florida, they call it Baker acted, where he had been involuntarily committed in the short term to a mental health organization or institution. So this was a guy with a mental health history, and I have read multiple press reports that he was able to not legally carry, but to legally obtain these weapons, and yet we haven't heard exactly where he got the weapons. On that federal firearms form you fill out when you purchase a firearm from, a store or a gun store or whatever, on that form, it asks, do you take illegal drugs, and are you being or have you ever been treated for a mental health issue? In fact, I believe it also separately asks if you have ever been suicidal. So obviously he lied. And that's when we talk about gun control, and the gun control activists love to talk about We need universal background check. Here's the problem with that is people lie. People lie on the form, and when you're talking about a background check, it's basically just a little computer check. It's not like a federal agent gets that form in their hand and then starts calling your family members and your neighbors to see what kind of person you are. It's very self-selective. So that's why when we talk about this, we need universal background checks. It's only going to work if people are honest, and people hell-bent on committing crime, generally speaking, aren't particularly honest. Now, would a uniformed police officer have prevented this attack at the Dollar General in Jacksonville, Florida on Saturday? I believe that to be true. This shooter originally went to Edward Waters University, which is a historically black university in the same neighborhood as the Dollar General. He went there, and students observed him starting to put on a tactical vest and a hat and a mask, and they alerted security, and campus security approached him, and he took off, and they alerted the Jacksonville law enforcement authorities, and they pursued him until he left campus. So, presumably a uniformed security guard was able to deter this shooter. He then went to a Family Dollar before he went to the Dollar General, where he ultimately killed 3 people. He went to a Family Dollar, and who was there? An armed security guard. So, yes, would law enforcement have been able to deter or prevent this shooting in the moment? Absolutely.
If you were a national spokesperson of the police, National Police Association, you are Sergeant Betsy Smith. If these cities wanted to actually get things right, can they lean on the police association to maybe get advice, to get strategy going? I feel like they don't want to even lean into the associations like yours to get help to fix these crime problems.
Well, everybody needs to understand who controls your police department. Who controls your police department? Your local political leaders. The American justice system, a lot of people don't really understand this. The American law enforcement system is very decentralized, unlike virtually every other country in the not have solely a federal police force, if you will. We don't have sole federal control of law enforcement and policies and training and things like that. Our system, and it's a wonderful system, I believe. It's very constitutional. Our law enforcement system is such that, if you live in a small town where you have 4 cops, it's your mayor and city council that you elect. They are the people who control law enforcement, who control local ordinances. And thus, if you live in New York City, who controls that police department? Ultimately, the mayor does and the city council, because they're the ones who choose the chiefs and the commissioner and things like that. So it's a very decentralized system, but people need to understand that it's your vote that controls. And I've heard from people, all of my adult life in law enforcement, why do you guys have these stupid laws? Police officers do not make law. We are simply tasked with enforcing the laws that legislators pass and command us to enforce. So if you want more police in your neighborhood, if you want to see more enforcement of laws in your neighborhood, in your county, in your state, it's not particularly on the police, it's on your legislators.
On that note, I'm so glad you mentioned it, because we as a city, I don't know if I don't remember personally doing this, but we as a city elected Mayor Adams, right? And Mayor Eric Adams had come in with this hope of reducing crime because he was in the police department for many years. He had that background. From where you sit, Sergeant Smith, I don't know if you followed, I'm sure you have. Has he lived up to protecting the police and helping the police in New York City fight crime, or has it kind of been the same old as it was under de Blasio. What are you seeing from an outsider perspective? Because from an insider perspective, it feels like crime's still rampant. And here we have this former NYPD, he was a member there, he was a leader there, but he's not doing enough on crime. What are you seeing, though, Sergeant?
Well, people from the NYPD that knew Eric Adams, that worked with Eric Adams, they were very open during the election process in saying that this guy was not exactly super cop. And, video surfaced of him saying very racially charged things about white police officers and bragging that he was going to do certain things to white police officers. He was not the best example of NYPD leadership. And so when he got elected, we already knew, it was very clear that he was going to be a politician first and a police leader second. But, I think everybody did have some hope that to curb crime in New York City, but he refused to go back to the policies of Rudy Giuliani, the broken windows policing and CompStat and all of that. In fact, he kept some of the policies of Bill de Blasio in place when it came to no stop and frisk. He encouraged policies of no cash bail. And then, and you New Yorkers are paying, he decided to spout off about how great it would be to be a sanctuary city. And that has spiraled so far out of control for New Yorkers as well as for the mayor. Right now, I'm sitting 80 miles from the southern border in Arizona. And, I fly almost every week. I see people getting on planes with, they have no ID, but they've got a plane ticket to places like New York and Chicago and New Jersey and Philadelphia. And this migrant crisis is in New York especially is just adding to an already disastrous crime situation, and then you can throw in Kathy Hochul and some of the things she did to take away the rights of citizens in the state to be able to protect themselves. And unfortunately, you guys are left with what you're obviously living right now.
And he willingly tells us, "Oh, you're going to be paying $12 billion." It's a mess, Sergeant. It's a mess. And have you helped, though, police officers in New York? Because you are a nonprofit that actually supports law enforcement. So have there been any stories out of New York that you can think of, like, oh, yeah, we helped that officer when he or she got injured on the job, support them through that?
Well, yeah, of course, we can't talk about individual officers. But, one of the things that we do is we get involved in cases where we see that an individual officer has maybe been treated badly by their police department, whether it was an injury or usually it was some sort of legal case where they didn't get the proper protections that they should get. We also give grants to police departments who don't have the funds to, for example, get body armor for their canine dogs or start an explorer program or a cadet program, things like that, and we tend to focus on with things like that, grants, smaller departments, but we also, with the national presence that we have, I'm in the media almost every day, and one of the biggest police departments I talk about, of course, is the NYPD, not only because I have friends there, but because this is the largest police department in the country that has just been demonized and vilified for the last 10 to 12 years. And it's so incredibly frustrating. And yet, what are they seeing in the NYPD? Record retirements, record resignations, and now for the first time in a time that I can remember, and I'm in my 60s, the NYPD is below 9,000 officers. That is absolutely unheard of, and that should send chills up the spines of any New Yorkers listening.
It does, and on the ground, it's tough to see it, tough to read about it almost every day in the papers, and that's why I feel like the departments and the city should lean on you guys for some advice and strategy on how to help even retain police officers, because maybe they're just struggling with that. Sergeant Smith, it's been so glad seeing you. I just actually subscribed to the newsletter on nationalpolice.org, so I'm going to try and stay involved as much as I can to support you guys as you support officers. But you got your start at age 17. I want to know about your background, because that's fairly young to be involved with the police. Is it a familial thing, a generational thing? Was your father or mom a cop? Or how did you get involved at age 17?
I'd love to say that I have this wonderfully altruistic and cool story, but I'll be honest, growing up in the 70s on a farm, there was only 3 television channels, and I watched a lot of cop shows. And so when I got into junior high, I told my parents I wanted to be a cop. Again, this is in the 70s when women really weren't cops in a mainstream way around the nation. So my dad talked to our local sheriff and said, hey, my daughter wants to be a cop. Do you have any positions she could work in so she could see what it's like? And they needed a police dispatcher to work 4 p.m. to midnight, 5 days a week. So as a senior in high school, that's what I did. And I'll be honest, it kept me out of trouble. I went to college, I did the same thing, and then 2 weeks out of college at age 21, I found myself in the police academy in a Chicago suburbs, and I've never looked back. It is never the same day twice, any job in law enforcement, and that's what makes me sad that kids are not coming to this job. But there are some who are, and I would encourage anybody out there who wants a life of true service and real adventure is look at your local police department.
Well, I was going to say, when we were younger, I remember that being a law enforcement officer, being a cop, was on top of every kid's dream, to be honest, because they saw how much work you guys put in and how great it was to serve and protect. But aren't the schools leading to the dismantling of police, meaning they're actually teaching kids, hey, don't like the cops? Am I right on that?
No, you're right. In certain areas, especially in more quote-unquote woke school districts, and that's one of the things the National Police Association is addressing. We are now providing homeschool materials to parents who want to homeschool their kids, or they want to provide additional curriculum outside of their public school curriculum where they can teach kids about law enforcement officers, the positive nature of a police officer, and where policing comes from. Sometimes we hear these teachers and politicians who say, "Oh, this arose out of American law enforcement rose out of slave patrols." That's nonsense. That's just a lie. And so we set the record straight on that. So I would encourage anybody to go to nationalpolice.org and look at our homeschooling materials. Whether you homeschool your kid or not, there's just some great information out there. Because children need to understand that the police are there to help them, not hurt them. And you're absolutely right, Alex. In some schools, they are told police are the bad guys.
Well, it's a far cry from, honestly, if I could say this, 22 years ago when we all honored what the first responders did on 9/11. And I know you were probably went through that as well and seeing all that. And how did we become a partisan issue? I thought law enforcement and first responders were not a partisan issue not so long ago. Like, everybody supported them.
You're correct. When I got hired, one of the things we were told is cops are apolitical, and we don't. And I did not know for 29 years. I really didn't know the politics of most of my colleagues. We did not talk about it. We did not tell the public, what kind of, who we voted for and things like that, because policing is supposed to be for everyone. I'm not supposed to look at your political party, your skin color, your sexual orientation, or any of that. When I'm a police officer, trying to help you. But, quite frankly, policing got politicized back in the 60s, and then we absolutely made a good comeback, and people saw what we did in the 90s, not just in New York, but beyond, to stem that 1990s crime problem that we had, very similar to what we're seeing now. And then you're absolutely right. I was a police sergeant on 9/11/01, and we just never experienced the support that we did that day and beyond, where everybody loved and supported our first responders. But then you go to 2014 to Ferguson, Missouri, the shooting of Michael Brown, the absolutely justified shooting of a strong arm robber and gangbanger named Michael Brown. And yet the Obama administration and the media decided to use that case to begin the vilification and the demonization of the American law enforcement officer, which, quite frankly, led to the war on cops that you're currently seeing now.
Pardon my ignorance, which department were you in during that time?
I don't talk about my agency because of the nature of what I do. Once in a while, my poor chief will get a phone call yelling at him about something. But it was one of the largest Chicago suburbs, and I was very proud to serve.
Well, then let's go to Chicago, because that's got to be heartbreaking for you in general to see these stores being ransacked, to see the Magnificent Mile, not so magnificent, I like to say. And I thought maybe Lori Lightfoot dropping out and not getting reelected, I should say, was going to bring a bright spot. But nothing's changed there. It's got to be heartbreaking as a Chicagoan to see that this great city is still overrun.
I just spent the weekend with my daughter and some of her friends in my beloved Chicago. I have lived in the city. 2 of my kids lived in the city. We all love Chicago, but it was very difficult to spend the weekend there and, see the way that the city has changed. Now, Chicagoans are resilient. So what did I see in a lot of the retail neighborhoods and the entertainment districts is the business owners have hired their own private security, and they've hired a lot of it. And I think that may save the city, because our new mayor, Brandon Johnson, nobody thought anybody could be worse than Lori Lightfoot, but he appears to be. He really is unrealistic about how he views crime. He doesn't seem to want to take on the street gangs. And of course, one of the things that he campaigned on is eliminating the gang database that provides Chicago police officers with so much intelligence. He's also talking about getting rid of the shot spotter technology that brings police officers to shooting scenes even before anybody can call 911. I don't know what Brandon Johnson's end game is, but I don't think it's going to work out well for the citizens of Chicago. But I have a lot of faith in the people of Chicago, and I think they may help save this city.
All right, one last thing. We are seeing patriots, if you will, rise up. You saw Curtis Lee would get arrested again the other day because he's tired of what's going on with this crisis. But I got to ask you, it still feels like a small majority that step up and support police. How can we expand that into a bigger voice, if you will?
Well, one of the things that the National Police Association is doing is we're telling people the truth about crime, the truth about law enforcement. We have positioned ourselves as the most pro-Second Amendment police organization in this country. So we're actually encouraging citizens to protect themselves and not just depend on law enforcement. And I believe that becomes a sort of kinship or a sort of community where I know when I was a police officer, I kind of knew the people in my patrol area who were those patriotic Americans who owned firearms and trained with them. And I knew that I could depend on them. So I think Americans' mutual appreciation of the Second Amendment is a great way for law enforcement and the citizens that we protect to sort of bond if you will. And I have a lot of hope that, because I'll tell you, we do polling. The National Police Association does polling, and every one of our polls that we engage in, people tell us they want more police in their neighborhood. They care about their police. They worry about our safety. They worry about our mental health, and they do not want their departments defunded. They want more funding, more training for their police departments. So the American public, it's not the American public, to be honest, that we're concerned about. It's the woke prosecutors. It's the anti-cop politicians. It's the anti-police activists who continue to try to convince the American public that law enforcement is the problem. And the number one thing that we do is tell the truth.
Well, on that note, so glad to have you. We got to get you back on for another conversation, Sergeant Betsy Smith. But thank you so much. And where can we find you? Is there an Instagram, Twitter? Where can we find the National Police Association? And can people contact you as well, or is that confidential?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I am on Twitter at Sergeant Betsy Smith. That's SG Betsy Smith. You can go to our website at nationalpolice.org. We have a fantastic X presence, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is at NAT, N-A-T, Police Assoc, A-S-S-O-C. We have a wonderful Facebook page. We have a great YouTube page where you can see so many terrific video podcasts and all the interviews that we do in the media. And sign up like you did for our newsletter at nationalpolice.org. The articles that we have, our authors are just absolutely top-notch. And you'll learn things that you'll be able to go to your neighbors and say, no, that's not true. Here's the truth about American law enforcement.
All right, Sergeant Smith, thank you so much. I could go on, but I wanted to save it and maybe tee up for another segment. I'd love to bring you back on.
Alex, let's do it soon. All
right, that was Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith on what went down in Jacksonville and just a state of law enforcement right now. And I'm glad that we're working together here to have one leg up for the police here on the Alex Garrett Podcast Network.